Evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. Another sultry night here on the Cape. Glad that everyone could survive Hurricanes Fred and Henri. So I'm glad you're with us. Couple things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books on our Safer at Home series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you participate in the local economy. And as I mentioned earlier, in case you missed it, we had some technical issues last night with the scheduled talk. So we're going to reschedule that, the Victory for the Vote with Doris Weatherford. I think Hurricane Henri was causing fits and starts with her connectivity. It was bothering Eventbrite. It wasn't pretty. So we're gonna try that one over. Our guest tonight, Jack Kelly, is a public scholar, historian, novelist. He's been on NPR, PBS, the History Channel. He lives in the Hudson Valley. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that he brought this book to my attention, Valcour, because this is honestly a battle I knew nothing about. And I suppose I'm not alone in that one, because this is one that was important and yet somehow always seems to miss the history book. So without further ado, would you welcome our guest tonight, Jack Kelly?
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and tuning in tonight. I'm going to turn over to a PowerPoint to if I can figure out how to do it. And I think some of the maps and images will give a better idea of what I'm talking about as I give the talk. So this is my book, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. And it's published by St. Martin's Press. I find that this is really one of the most interesting campaigns for a number of reasons in the Revolutionary War. And it's also, I call it the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War. And I'll go into in a few minutes to a couple of reasons why I call it that. To start out, to orientate you to the situation, it's July of 1776. The Patriots have just declared independence from England, and they're facing a very dire military situation. The British have decided to put down the rebellion in one season in 1776, and they sent over the largest expeditionary army in their history to America to achieve that. The target of that army was a corridor that goes down the St. Lawrence River from Quebec, down the Richelieu River to Lake Champlain, Lake George, and then down the Hudson River to New York. This was the main water access to the interior of America. It was the only route down from Canada into the colonies. And in particular, it was the back door to New England. So if they got down onto establish a position on Lake Champlain or Lake George, they could attack eastward into the New England states, which we're seeing as the heart of the rebellion. The Patriots had understood the strategic importance of that corridor because they had used it the year before to invade northward from Crown Point and Ticonderoga, which were a couple of forts they took from the British in 1775. That fall, they attacked northward in an attempt to invade and take over Canada and add Canada as the 14th colony. They took Montreal, they got as far as Quebec City, and then they got stuck up there. They were there all winter, and when the first of the components of that British expeditionary force landed in Canada, the American army panicked. They then retreated 200 miles down back to where they come from in Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. The invasion of Canada is not generally covered in the with very much prominence. I think partly because it's embarrassing to think that they patriots, these freedom-loving patriots, their first impulse was to invade a neighboring province, but also because of the disaster. The army that came down to Crown Point and Ticonderoga was totally a beaten army. They had lost much of their equipment in Canada. They had lost a lot of men. The morale and discipline was non-existent. And they'd also contracted an epidemic of smallpox while they were up there. So of the 5,000 men who arrived back in Fort Ticonderoga, 3,000 of them were sick with smallpox and had to be quarantined. So it was a very tenuous army that was given the task of stopping the British invasion that they knew was going to be coming down this same waterway. The fate of the nation in the North rested, and this is just to give you a little orientation, this is Crown Point, which was a fort that the British had built there, and Fort Ticonderoga, which actually had been built by the French. They're about 12 miles apart, where Lake George comes into Lake Champlain. And the fate of the nation depended on three men. The man who was in overall control of the Northern Army was General Philip Schuyler. He was an Albany aristocrat, actually spoke Dutch at home, as did everybody in Albany at that time. He was very wealthy, but he had very little battle experience as a general. And he was also quite sickly. He spent most of his time commanding from his mansion in Albany. His man on the spot at Fort Ticonderoga was Horatio Gates. Gates was an experienced officer. He had been in the British Army for many years. But like Schuyler, he was not really a battle general. He was more of a staff officer. And he had a very high opinion of his own abilities, and was always plotting how he was going to take over the army from George Washington. And the man who would actually face the British in battle was Benedict Arnold. And Arnold, before the war, had absolutely no military experience. And of course, 4 years later, he would betray his country. So it seemed like this was a very much a second string a group of officers that had this very vital task of stopping the British from coming down. But in fact, General Schuyler was a genius of logistics. He had been a businessman for many years, and he had a lot of purchase and ship all the implements they needed to build a fleet on Lake Champlain to stop the British from coming down the lake. General Gates was a genius of organization. He was very good at restoring morale, restoring discipline, knew how to deal with the smallpox, and was generally a great administrator. Benedict Arnold turned out to be a genius of war itself. He just had a natural knack for strategy and tactics. And as a bonus, he had been a sea captain before the war, so he understood boats and sailing. So that July, there began an arms race. The British were building a fleet here in St. John's, which is on the Richelieu River that flows out of Lake Champlain. They had to build it there because they couldn't sail up from the St. Lawrence because of rapids in between. And the Americans were at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain, a place called Skeensboro, which is now Whitehall, New York, that was their place where they started building their fleet. What they were, the Americans had captured a couple of schooners on the lake. These were about 50 feet long. This was one called the Royal Savage that they'd taken from the British. Um, so the types of boats they were talking about that were quite small. They wanted to build gunboats, which were about 50 feet long. Also had 3 cannon. They had a sail, but because they had no keel, they were totally flat on the bottom. They were mainly rowboats, and they could only put the sails up when the wind was directly from behind. This is actually a very faithful model of one of those gunboats that the Americans had that was built by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And it gives you an idea of sort of the scale of the ships that they had on the lake. Interesting to note, there's about a dozen people on this boat. The actual crew on one of these gunboats was 44, so it would have been much more crowded with men. What the Americans really wanted was these slightly larger boats that were called row galleys that were about 74 feet long. They could be sailed quite handily on the lake or rowed. They had sweep oars. They carried a few more cannon on their sides and were a little bit more formidable ships, but very hard to build because they did have a keel, they had a shaped hull, and they needed a real experienced shipwright to build them, and there were very few of those in the interior of New York. So this is a view of Fort Ticonderoga, which is down in here, which is where the Skeensboro, where they're building the ships, would be off to the right here. And this river you see is the inlet of Lake George into Lake Champlain. So you can see how narrow Lake Champlain is at this point. And this is a diagram of the fortifications that they built there. Fort Ticonderoga was a ruin at that point, and so they needed to build smaller forts and gun emplacements around that peninsula and also over on the other side of the lake to meet the British if they came down. They actually put a boom to slow the British boats down if they made it that far. In August, Benedict Arnold had a very keen sense of time in warfare and the importance of time. And so rather than wait for the fleet to be completed, he took a portion of the fleet. It was about 6 gunboats. None of the galleys had been completed yet by the end of August. And he sailed up to the very northern end of Lake Champlain at the Canadian border. And you can see how complex the lake was up there. He wanted to train his crews. A lot of the men in the boats had been drawn from the Army and really knew nothing about sailing. He wanted to get as much intelligence as he could about the British, who were a little bit farther up the Richelieu River. And he wanted himself and his captains to learn this terrain of this lake. There were many coves and inlets, and he had to know how deep they were, whether they could get their ships through them. And you see down here, a little bit farther down the lake, Valcour Island, which will come into the story in a minute. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1776, George Washington was having a bad time of it in New York. He had a 20,000-man army in New York City. British landed 40,000 men on Staten Island. They fought him at Long Island in August, soundly defeated the Patriot Army. They took over New York City in September. Washington's army barely escaped. By October, they were fighting up in White Plains. And in November and December, Washington was pushed across the Hudson River and retreated all the way down to the other side of the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. His army of 20,000 men was now shrunk down to about 3,000. He'd been beaten in every meeting he had with. He wrote to his brother at that point and said, I think the game is pretty near up. So it was really one of the low points in American history. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold and his men kept waiting for the British. They were here from August. They were sailing around this area of the lake for an entire month, waiting for the British to come down. Very difficult duty. These boats were open boats for the most part. They had a canopy that they could put over, but there was no cabin. There was no enclosure. There was a lot of storms came down the lake in the autumn. It gets cold up there in September. Anybody that's been up there knows you sometimes see snow in September. They were constantly wet. There were no berths or hammocks. The men had to sleep on the decks of the boats. They could rarely go on land because there were British patrols moving down the lake. They were lacking in warm clothes. They also lacked a lot of gunpowder and weapons, and in particular the galleys. Arnold kept sending messages back to General Gates, where are these row galleys? It was the main armament of the fleet, and they couldn't get them finished. Towards the end of September, Arnold moved the fleet down here to Valcour Island. He wanted to be a little closer to Ticonderoga in case they had to retreat. And it was a good place to protect a little cove that's in between Valcour Island and the New York shore, where the fleet would be protected and also hidden. There was no way to see it as you were coming down the main channel. He continued to wait. Finally, 3 of the galleys were finished, and they arrived and brought some warm clothes and some very welcome barrels of rum. He waited another week, and finally on October 11th, the scouts came in, the lookout boats came in, so the British are coming. They've seen sails on the horizon. And the British fleet that Arnold faced was led, they're now in this area, and the British are coming down. The British fleet was led by this man, General Guy Carleton, a very capable soldier, not really very experienced as a naval man. He was a very cautious general, but that morning he felt very confident. The time that Arnold had been waiting for him, he had been building a schooner or a frigate. And this is a sort of a generic, in those days, this was an ocean-going ship with 3-masted, square-rigged, massive broadside of cannon, practically had more firepower than the entire American fleet. In addition to that, he had several schooners. He had an artillery barge that was almost as big as this, with heavy guns on it. He had 22 gunboats. The Americans had only 8. So generally, the very formidable fleet coming down. Benedict Arnold's fleet is now waiting in this cove here, and a lot of his officers are saying we better retreat, try to outrun the British if we can. And Arnold said, no, we're going to stay and fight. He somehow intuited a couple of things. One was that the British would not come down the lake unless they had the wind at their back. So in fact, that was true. That morning there was a brisk wind coming from the north. And the other was that General Carleton would probably be in a hurry to catch up to him. He would have assumed that the American fleet had retreated, and he would be hurrying down the lake to try to catch up with them, rather than exploring all these little inlets and coves along the way. And that was exactly what happened. It was almost like he read Carleton's mind. And so the British came tearing down the lake, and they got down into this area. Arnold sent a few ships out to fire at them from behind to provoke them. But then they had to turn around and sail north into this very narrow bay, not knowing the waters very much. This is their first foray out onto Lake Champlain. And it turned out that the larger British ships could not tack enough back and forth to get up into the bay where the American battle line was. The British gunboats were, like the American gunboats, were largely rowboats, so they were able to move up into that space between, it's about a mile offshore from New York shore, and form their own battle line, and they began a cannon duel. This is one of the cannons that would have been on the side of one of the American gunboats, a 9-pounder cannon. This was a very brutal form of warfare, very stressful, let's say. There was no taking cover. There was no hiding. There was no running away. You simply had to stand there and hope one of these cannonballs, which could go blast right through oak plank, didn't hit you. And people were killed. People that were sailors that were killed were just immediately thrown overboard. And so very gruesome and very hectic, chaotic form of warfare, shooting back and forth for 7 hours. And because the British ships weren't the main British ships were not able to get into the battle, it turned out to be a draw. The darkness came. Both sides had suffered some damage. The Americans lost one ship, one gunboat called the Philadelphia, that sank right after dark. One of the British gunboats sank. The American gunboat, the American fleet in general, though, was pretty well shot up. This gives a little bit of a look at artist's conception of what the battle might have looked like. This is one of the American galleys, and you can see the torn sails and the damage that was done. A lot of the American ships were taking on water. They'd also expanded at 3/4 of their ammunition, and it seemed like they had two choices. One was to surrender the fleet or to wait until morning, and particularly if the wind switched around from the south, which it looked like it was going to do, then the major British ships could have sailed down and obliterated them. Crews would have been slaughtered. But Benedict Arnold thought there was a third option, which was to escape. And the time that they'd spent learning the terrain of the northern part of Lake Champlain paid off, because they knew exactly how close to the shore they could come. And in the dark, with the British fleet sitting right at the entrance to this bay, in the dark, the ships made a line and they just very quietly moved down. And by morning, they were down at this point. The British were waiting to finish them off. When it got light, they were absolutely flabbergasted that the Americans were gone. That began a day of really a 2-day chase down the lake until about Split Rock, and a little bit below that. The British had faster ships, so the Americans had the head start. The British caught up to them, and they captured one of the American galleys with 110 men on it. A number of the other American ships sank on the way down from the damage from the original battle. And Arnold took a stand with I think he had 4 gunboats left and a galley that he was on, and took a stand around this area, fought for another 2.5 hours against the really major British ships, the frigate and the other ships. Decided to direct his fleet into a little cove that you can hardly see here. It's called Ferris Bay. And they ran the boats aground. set them on fire so the British couldn't get them, and made a point of keeping the flags flying rather than surrender. And then Arnold marched his men down and crossed over to Crown Point and went on to Fort Ticonderoga. Interesting to note that that bay, Ferris Bay, was later renamed Arnold Bay. And I was saying in some of the talks I gave, I was saying that was the only place in America ever named in honor of Benedict Arnold after his betrayal of his country. But there's actually a pond up in the very northern part of Maine where the autumn before, when they were invading Canada, Arnold had led a march up through Maine and to attack Quebec. And one of the ponds that they crossed over is still named for Benedict Arnold. So it's not the only place, but it's one of the few places. So the British landed at Crown Point. The Americans couldn't defend that now with the British fleet coming down. Americans concentrated their defenses at Fort Ticonderoga, and they waited for the attack. They waited a week and then another week. And then finally they sent scouts up to Crown Point, and they announced the British were gone. And General Carleton had decided that because it was so late in the season, this is now getting close to November, that he wasn't willing to lay siege to Fort Ticonderoga, because he was afraid that if he got into a battle like that and the lake froze behind him, that would have been a disaster. That would have cut off their supply lines back to Canada. So he figured he'd done enough. He destroyed the American fleet for the most part, and he would go back and spend the winter in Montreal or Quebec, and come down again in the spring and finish the job. Essentially, he lost his nerve, comes down to it. So I refer to this as the most important campaign, and once the British went back to Canada, the campaign was over. The most important unknown campaign of the Revolutionary War for a couple of reasons. 1776 was really the best chance the British had to win the war outright. They would have other chances later in the war for negotiated settlement, but if they could have broken the Patriot effort in 1776, they had the preponderance of force. The Patriots were their most disorganized. They would have won the war, and they came very close to doing that. And this campaign was one of the factors that prevented them from winning the war, as long as they were able to maintain that army in Fort Ticonderoga. So that was enormously important to give the Patriots time to allow them to eventually get allied with the French. So that delay, that pushing back of the inevitable, what seemed to be the inevitable, was hugely important, and this Northern campaign was a very big factor in that. The other factor I think that makes this extremely important is that once the British retreated back to Canada, Benedict Arnold and General Gates marched 600 men from Fort Ticonderoga, no longer needed there, down to join Washington's army in Pennsylvania. And Washington at that time was trying to make a decision. We don't know what factors he considered, but I think it's reasonable to assume that he knew that the threat from the north was over. He had these 600 additional men to join his army, and it may have been a factor in him deciding to cross the Delaware on Christmas night and attack the Hessians at Trenton and win probably one of his, probably the most important victory in the war that really revived the Patriot morale, revived the cause. It allowed the Patriots to take over Western New Jersey, and just absolutely crucial to continuing of the effort. The fact is that some of the men who fought at Valcour Island in October also crossed the Delaware with Washington and fought at Trenton in December. I mentioned earlier, this is the replica of the American gunboat on Lake Champlain. It was actually a replica of the Philadelphia, built as accurately as possible to what the Philadelphia looked like. 30s, divers found the Philadelphia, and it was sitting in the bottom of Valcour Harbor, and they were able to salvage it. And it found its way, and this gives a little bit of idea how big these boats were, which was not very big. And the Philadelphia is now in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And I think to me, it's one of the most poignant relics of the Revolutionary War, because it's the real thing. This is not a replica, it's not a model. This is the actual boat, almost 250 years later, that faced the British in battle. These are the actual guns that fired at the British. This bow cannon, when it was brought up, was still loaded, and the planks of that along the deck of the Philadelphia actually did absorb the blood of people who were fighting for independence. So, and actually, you can see down here is the 24-pounder British cannonball that caused it to sink. So if you're ever down in Washington, the Smithsonian, it's really worth having a look at. I'd just like to finish up by saying that recently there's been a lot of questioning of the relevance of the American Revolution, and people make the point that the founders were flawed characters and maybe shouldn't be held in much regard anymore. But I think that, like any historian, I certainly understand the need to examine the flaws and failings of the founding generation. But I think we also have to keep in mind that they were putting forth an idea that no person is superior by birth, and an idea that people have inalienable rights that are not dependent on their position or wealth, but that are simply because they're human beings. This was a startling idea at a time when monarchy and aristocracy pretty much dominated the world. And I think it's helpful to focus on those who fought in the war, because they fought for that idea. And they were common people. These were not aristocrats. Even many of the officers were just common laborers or craftsmen. So 3 months after independence, when no one knew who would win the war and the nation was divided, these men were willing to go to this remote northern lake and face cannon fire for an idea. And when they did so, they were thinking about us. And there are many references in the letters and diaries of the time to generations unborn. So maybe in these times, when the country's going through its own difficulties and divisions, it's important to learn about these people and their actions and their courage and their perseverance, because it can inspire us to believe that there's still life in that idea. So I appreciate everyone listening. That's the end of my presentation. Anyone wants to get in touch or learn more about the book, I have a website, jackkellybooks.com. And if you have any questions or comments or things you'd like me to go into more detail about, I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. That was excellent. Given the importance of this campaign, why do we know so little about it? I mean, and the question is, how did you come across this topic? I'm sure it's probably because in some no small part of where you live, but where did you come across it, and why is this so underreported?
Yeah, I had written a book previously called Band of Giants, which was a kind of overview of the Revolutionary War, looking at the middle levels of the Continental Army, some of the officers that don't get as much recognition as George Washington and Lafayette and so forth. And this was one of the campaigns that I happened to come across, and like you, Mark, I didn't really know that much about it at the time. I hadn't been up there. I think one of the reasons that that it was less prominent then and has been less prominent ever since is that it happened so far up in the north, and it's still a pretty remote area up there. I usually cite the book 1776 by David McCullough. That was an excellent book. I have a huge amount of respect for David McCullough as one of our great narrative historians. And he wrote a book about the war in the year 1776. And he didn't mention the Northern Campaign whatsoever. It wasn't, he slighted it or gave it short shrift. He simply didn't mention it. So why is that? And I think the answer really comes down to Benedict Arnold, that the story of Benedict Arnold has a bad ending, as we all know. He was a hero at this time during the war, but nobody, and it's a lot easier to sing the praises of George Washington. And so I think that was really, and you see that in some of the other achievements of Benedict Arnold, such as taking Fort Ticonderoga earlier in 1775, about 6 weeks after the fighting at Lexington and Concord. Arnold went to Fort Ticonderoga and they took it over from the British. That was hugely important in the war, but you don't hear too much about it. So usually a footnote to the history. Because it was Benedict Arnold that did it. He actually was sort of partnered with Ethan Allen in that operation, but he was the brains behind it. So I think that is a lot of the explanation for why the whole campaign is not more widely known.
He remains one of the most enigmatic figures in American military history. People forget he was undefeated as an American general. Where did you mentioned that Arnold had been involved as a naval captain or as a seaman prior to his days as a general. Where did he develop naval skills? And question here: did any of the American boats take on the British frigate directly?
For the first question, his father was a merchant in Connecticut, and he also had a few ships, trading ships. The main trading lines were down to the West Indies, and when Benedict Arnold was a boy, he would go with his father down to the West Indies. His father became an alcoholic, and the business went broke, Arnold had to then be apprenticed to a family that was friendly to his mother, that were usually referred to as apothecaries, and um, they were really kind of international traders. And so he worked for them, and then set up doing that same type of business himself. And unlike a lot of the merchants who would just send ships out and with cargo and bring back cargo, he actually went on the ships. He'd already learned basics of sailing, and that was hugely important to his military career, because not having any military training, he still had that experience of the type of command and the leadership and handling of men, handling of sailors. You had to be very tough, very strict discipline when you're out on the high seas, because there was piracy, there was mutinies. So just not really military strategy, but just being a leader and a commander by being this sea captain. And he traded to the West Indies and also went up to Canada. So he was quite familiar with Canada. He had been up and traded in Montreal, and knew quite a few people up there, and had really been not, I wouldn't say all over the world, but he'd been to the West Indies and then to England. They'd take cargo over to England. And it was, that was his background. As his row galley finally did come face to face with the British frigate in that second battle that was 2 days later from the one on October 11th, and shot it out with them. And that was, they had quite a few casualties and took a lot of damage, and that was what really forced him to have to take the fleet into the cove and destroy it, but rather than surrender. So that they did have a 2.5-hour fight with the frigate and a couple of other British boats down closer down to Crown Point and Ticonderoga.
We do tend to forget, I mean, in the 21st century, that Lake Champlain and that upstate New York area really was the frontier at the time, and just how important, particularly in the French and Indian War, and then later in the Revolutionary War, just how vital that waterway was. What other stories about this campaign or that northern experience have you uncovered, that, like Valcour, that we don't know a lot about, but we should?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because though it was remote, and it really was totally wilderness, there was very few settlers in anywhere on Lake Champlain, particularly in the north. It was just too remote from anywhere. And yet it was a transportation corridor, and had been, beginning with the Native Americans had used it. They called it the Great Warpath, and that was sort of divided different territories of different Indian tribes. And it was had been used for that purpose through many of the wars in the 18th century, and particularly, as you mentioned, in the French and Indian War. The French controlled all the way down to what was Fort Ticonderoga, and they built the fort there. They called Fort Caroline, in the 1740s, late 1740s, attacking up there through Canada. So it was a very, very vital spot in the continent as to who controlled what. The British tried to take over, and I think it was in 1758, during the French and Indian War. They tried to take Fort Ticonderoga from the French, and they had a General Abercrombie attacked before he got his artillery in place, and the French very wisely had entrenched themselves out on the peninsula that was the approach to Ticonderoga, and they took the British apart, and Abercrombie wouldn't back down, and he kept sending in more and more and more troops. And interestingly, that was the bloodiest battle, single day battle, until the American Civil War, which was, more than 100 years later. That the British, it was one of the worst defeats the British ever suffered in warfare. And they paid a huge price and then finally they did come back and take Ticonderoga from the French, but it was at this was a huge price. And so the thing that made it easy for the Americans was that once Canada fell at the end of the French and Indian War to the British, they no longer needed these forts. Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point were both obsolete. The British had, I think, fewer than 40 men at Ticonderoga and even less than that at Crown Point. In 1775, when Arnold and Ethan Allen showed up there, and so they were easily able to take it because there was just no reason to have a fort. They didn't expect that there would be an uprising, and it was not, the French were no longer a factor. So,
we know Gates has a long career throughout the war. We obviously know about Arnold. What becomes of Schuyler?
Well, Schuyler was really not cut out for as a military leader, as I've sort of alluded to, even though he was one of the first. He was there was 4 major generals appointed when Washington was made commander of the Continental Army, and he was one of them. But he didn't really have the military the background, I guess you would say, to be a battle leader or a leader of an army. And he's continued on after the Battle of another year, commanding in the north. He had then, as most people would know, that the following year, the British did come down. It wasn't General Carleton this time, it was General Burgoyne, and they did take Ticonderoga. Schuyler was blamed for that, even though it really wasn't his fault. And he had to struggle to keep his position. And finally, he was pushed out by Horatio Gates, who had been trying to push him out ever since he got there. And it was General Gates was the hero of Saratoga when Burgoyne was defeated at Saratoga and had to surrender his whole army in 1777. So that was the end of Schuyler's military career. He became a politician and was actually quite a prominent politician. I think it was in the first Senate after the Constitution. And it was still a very powerful force. It came from a very old family in Albany, and I don't think he was all that unhappy to get out of the army, because he was not, given his illnesses and his lack of experience. I think he was not really completely suited for what he was doing.
How long did it take for you to research this, and do you have another project lined up?
Well, I probably spent a couple of years, maybe a little over 2 years, researching and writing this particular book. I had known quite a bit about it before I began the book, so I was fairly familiar with all the ins and outs of it. But as I've been doing some of the publicity for the book, a lot of people have asked me questions about Benedict Arnold, and a lot of people have said, I never knew, I thought he was just a traitor. I thought though there's been many, many biographies of Benedict Arnold written, I'm going to attempt a biography of Benedict Arnold that kind of shows his heroism. We all know that he's a traitor, and there's really there's no condoning or making light of his treason, because it was very, very serious. But he had a period in the first 3 years of the war when he was very heroic. And I think it's interesting to look at at that kind of complexity of a human being who could be both. He could be both a traitor and a hero. People question George Washington. Well, he was a great general. He was, you know, a very great president, but he was a slave. There's no way to erase that. You have to understand him as a individual, and a complex individual, paradoxical in a lot of ways. Same thing with Jefferson and a lot of the founders. And with Arnold, it's so obvious that he's a paradoxical figure, because he was both one of the greatest heroes of the war and one of the worst scoundrels, that I think it makes for an interesting character study. So I'm going to do a fairly short book just to highlight him as a hero, and then leave it to the reader to understand that, you know, what happened after his heroism was that he became a traitor.
That's a topic I could embrace. All right. I want to thank you for doing this, and you're the one that actually brought this book to my attention. So I thank you very much for this. Thank you for taking the time to do this. The name of the book is Valcour. His name is Jack Kelly. Good luck with this, and thanks for taking the time tonight.
Right. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good luck with this, Mr. Kelly, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.